Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the journal stands approved. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 383, I call up House Res 2 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the clerk will report H.R. 2.
H.R. 2, a bill to secure the borders of the United States and for other purposes.
Pursuant to House Resolution 383, the amendment specified in Section 3 of the resolution is adopted, and the bill as amended is considered read. The bill as amended shall be debatable for 5 hours, with 2 hours equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member. The bill as amended shall be debatable for 5 hours, with 2 hours equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Homeland Security or their respective designees. 2 hours equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their respective designees, and 1 hour equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs or their respective designees. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Green, and the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, each will control 60 minutes. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, will each control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Green.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on H.R. 2.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of House Resolution 2, the Secure the Border Act of 2023. Last year, Republicans made a commitment to America to secure our borders, protect our nation, and safeguard our communities. Today, House Republicans are delivering on that promise. No matter where you sit on the political spectrum, it is undeniable that we are in the midst of a severe border crisis. In just over 2 years, President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas have intentionally turned our nation's border into a place of chaos and devastation, one controlled by the drug cartels. The administration's refusal to enforce the law or implement effective policies to secure the border has led us to this point, completely dismantling any semblance of law and order. Over the past several months, the members of the Committee on Homeland Security have been hard at work crafting a solution to address the administration's self-inflicted crisis at our borders. With input from our colleagues across the Republican conference, as well as Border Patrol agents, victims of illegal alien crime and the drug crisis, small business owners, state and local law enforcement, and farmers and ranchers, the committee has taken the time to fully understand Secretary Mayorkas' record-breaking humanitarian crisis. These are the everyday Americans bearing the brunt of this crisis who are all too often overlooked by the media and the D.C. Beltway. The numbers that they and now all Americans are facing are staggering. More than 5 million encounters at the southwest border since President Biden took office. Over 1.4 million known gotaways since February 2021. 193 aliens on the terrorist watch list encountered along the southwest border, trying to enter the country between ports of entry from fiscal year 21 to fiscal year 2023. Over 14,000 pounds of fentanyl seized in fiscal year 23, enough to kill the entire U.S. population 9.5 times. Over 61,000 criminal aliens arrested by CBP attempting to cross the U.S. borders since the beginning of FY 2021. And just as we think it can't get any worse, tomorrow marks the end of the only tool that Customs and Border Protection has left under the administration, Title 42. As we've approached the end of Title 42 the past few days, CBP has been reporting an even greater increase in the number of alien encounters and gotaways, which are already off the charts. Whether my colleagues on the other side want to admit it or not, Mr. Biden and Mr. Mayorkas' border crisis has turned every state into a border state, and the American people have had enough. From a record number of fentanyl deaths to rising crime, it is the families and communities across America that are left to pay the price of this administration's open borders and anti-security policies. These policies are enriching and emboldening transnational criminal organizations who have increasingly threatened the safety and security of all Americans. But we're here with a solution. Thanks to the hard work of many members across multiple committees, House Resolution 2 requires the administration to secure the border, enforce the law, reduce illegal immigration once again. Specifically, Division A of the bill addresses the immediate impact of the border crisis by focusing on mitigating and stopping the surge of illegal border crossers and illicit drugs that are flowing across our borders between ports of entry. Over 30 years ago, the United States government began building the border barrier system. We've heard from frontline agents on the ground that an effective border barrier system is a proven critical component in deterring and discouraging illegal activity. That is why House Resolution 2 directs the Secretary of Homeland Security to immediately resume construction of the border wall. The bill requires at least 900 miles of wall to be built, using the materials that American taxpayers have already paid for, but that under President Biden and laying unused and left to deteriorate in the desert. This bill makes targeted investments in border technology that not only supplements the border wall system, but also integrates new, advanced, and improved technologies into the Border Patrol operations that will prioritize frontline personal safety and the detection of illicit activity. We know that Border Patrol agents are leaving at a faster rate than the CBP commissioner can hire them. Under the Biden administration, Border Patrol agents are stretched thin, both physically and mentally. They are overwhelmed and overworked. Customs and Border Protection agents are leaving before reaching their retirement eligibility because of poor working conditions and low morale due to a horrendous lack of support from the Biden administration and the inability to do what they signed up to do, enforce the law. During the committee's field hearing on March 15th, Border Patrol Chief Raul Ortiz testified that he needs approximately 22,000 agents to achieve Border Patrol's mission. H.R. 2 mandates CBP expand their force by over 3,000 agents to reach that total of 22,000 agents. The bill also aims to return agents back to their law enforcement duties in the field by ensuring they are not responsible for serving as processing coordinators, something that the Biden administration is forcing highly trained law enforcement agents to do. The bill addresses the retention challenges that Border Patrol is facing by providing qualified agents with a retention bonus. They need to know that all of us in Congress have their back and appreciate their sacrifice. The Department of Homeland Security has made very blatant attempts to bury the release of its monthly border statistics or withhold certain information from the public. That is why H.R. 2 requires DHS to publicly disclose all monthly data, including known gotaways and known or suspected terrorists, before the 7th day of each month. Congress will not tolerate this administration's lack of transparency to the American people, who deserve to know who and what is coming into our country. To further enhance border security measures, this bill increases support for Operation Stone Garden, a grant program that provides funds to state and local and tribal law enforcement agencies that are forced to deal directly with the crisis given the administration's complete dereliction of duty. Under H.R. 2, Operation Stone Garden grants will be increased to $110 million per year, and we know this support can't come soon enough for our state and local law enforcement. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to the Child Deportation Act. This cruel inhumane and unworkable bill was written in an extreme mega Republican echo chamber. Consider H.R. 2 today. Under a closed rule is a cynical move on the part of Republicans to exploit the operational challenges associated with the lifting of Title 42 public health restrictions. Republicans have a short memory. Just in February, they voted to lift Title 42 when they voted to lift the COVID-19 health emergency. It sets Customs and Border Protection up for failure by shifting all processing to ports of entry without providing any additional resources. To make matters worse, it would bar CBP from leveraging technology to process migrants in an orderly way. H.R. 2 doesn't fund a single new officer at our ports of entry, where more than 90% of fentanyl is interdicted. In committee, we tried to get an additional 1,700 officers to build greater capacity, but Republicans refused to do it. Furthermore, this xenophobic bill would strip DHS funding from any community or religious organization that helps migrants. The language is so broad that an organization that places water in a remote area of the desert or provides a pregnant mother a safe place to sleep would be ineligible for DHS funding. It is so broad that they may be refused Homeland Security grants to help protect their facilities. Denying assistance to nonprofits is just plain shameful, particularly after what we saw in Brownsville this past weekend. There is reporting that a man who rammed his SUV into a crowd outside a migrant shelter, killing 8 and injuring at least 10 others, was fueled by invasion and alien rhetoric. My heart goes out to everyone hurt by this senseless act of violence. The language in this bill is so far-reaching that it would force the American Red Cross to verify every person's immigration status before providing life-saving services. Can you imagine if they had to say, show your papers before evacuating people? That's just inhumane. And get this, H.R. 2 is so broadly written that it would actually impede detention and deportation. Mr. Speaker, Fox News viewers who support deporting migrants should take a look at Section 115C in Division A. If enacted, it would prohibit DHS from contracting with any non-governmental organization to transport or shelter, quote, inadmissible aliens, unquote. This language would prevent ICE from contracting with private companies to facilitate deportation or provide detention space because these companies are non-governmental organizations. Yes, you heard that right. This bill is so poorly written that it could actually prevent ICE from deporting people. Over the next 2 hours, Democrats will discuss many other problematic provisions of this extreme mega bill that Republicans cobbled together and that we learned yesterday would blow a $6.1 billion hole in the budget. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this Child Deportation Act, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Mississippi reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the chairman and thank Mr. Speaker. My colleagues across the aisle say we have a short memory. We don't have a short memory. This has seemed like an eternity the last 2 years. We had no idea as a nation that this much injury could be brought upon our country in this short a period of time. H.R. 2 is the strongest border security package that has ever been brought to the floor in this body. And why has the majority party, the Republicans that were elected into power by the American people last year. Why have we drafted this bill over the course of the last year? Carefully and strategically, because we're responding to the total collapse of our sovereignty at the southern border, brought upon America by my colleagues across the aisle. If you want more of what you see on the TV today, then by all means, America can support my Democratic colleagues and their policies, because those are the policies that have brought this disaster upon our nation. H.R. 2 addresses it aggressively. Our southern border is no longer a sovereign border wherein America controls the northern portion and Mexico controls the southern. It's now a theater of engagement controlled by the cartels. H.R. 2 corrects it. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to stand in support of H.R. 2 because it addresses aggressively the injury that our nation suffers, brought upon us by weak, disastrous policies out of the Democrat executive branch, White House, and Democrat majority control for the last 4 years. Mr. Chairman, I urge strong support of H.R. 2, and I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields as the gentleman from Tennessee reserved. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the extreme MAGA Republican Default on America Act, which the last speaker voted for, would result in an across-the-board cut of 22% for the Department of Homeland Security, which would undermine border security. Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and this bears an important, absolute and imperative necessity of a little walk down memory lane. Actuality, the American people really want to uphold her values, the values that they have come to understand as a core of who we are. And the Homeland Security Committee traditionally, as the chairman and I have seen over the years, worked in a bipartisan manner. Little history that just more than a decade ago, there was a bipartisan comprehensive immigration bill led by the late John McCain. Unfortunately, interestingly enough, the Senate moved and the House simply imploded that dream. The dream that those who came to this country without anything and did not know they had come wrongly, if you will, young people could be DACA recipients and ultimately work their way towards citizenship. There was an effective asylum process, and we argued vigorously for legal immigration, and people dutifully got online. But consistently, as we refused to build on the comprehensive immigration structure, even though Democrats supported heavily enhancing the border, my bill some years ago provided enormously new equipment and technology. And one of our colleagues even explained, by the way, this new border wall that everyone wants to talk about is not a border wall because it's indented onto U.S. soil. So once you get over to the wall, you're already eligible to apply for asylum. And most of the people who come through legal points of entry. So why the cruelty of this bill? I can be for legal immigration and I can be for securing this nation, and I don't have to take a sledgehammer and bloody the very fabric of this nation. It is interesting that we offered 43 Democratic amendments. None were accepted. Is there something wrong with body cameras for our officers at the border? Not accepted. Something wrong with refusing to separate 9-month-old and 5-year-old from their families? Family unification, committing to not separating families, is that something wrong? I work with NGOs. I'm in Texas, I'm in Houston. We're getting some of those migrants right in Houston, and there will be an NGO that will be dealing with individuals. who are not status. But what you want to have happen, as is happening in El Paso because of the overwhelming, that you want no resources, you want people on the street, and I'm so sad and shameful to say the loss of individuals in Brownsville in what seemed to be a murderous rage. So we cannot do this, and I urge Republicans to support detaining and deporting more migrants to take a look at Section 115C in Division A. If enacted, it would prohibit DHS from...
Time has expired. The gentleman from Mississippi, would you like to yield more of your time?
I yield an additional minute to the gentlelady from Texas.
The gentlelady is recognized for a minute.
Appreciate the gentleman. If 115C in Division A, if enacted, it would prohibit DHS from contracting with any non-governmental organization to transport or shelter, quote, inadmissible aliens, unquote. What is that? This language would prevent ICE from being able to contract with private companies that facilitate deportations or provide detention space because they are non-governmental organizations. Ironically, it seems that this Child Deportation Act may actually undermine our friends on the other side, the MAGA deportation agenda. Why are we not more committed, Mr. Speaker, to coming together around the ideals of the Statute of Liberty? Bring us your forlorn, your worn, your desperate. Yes, they're coming in droves, but the President has a plan. And there will be more interaction with Guatemala. There will be processes in Mexico. There will be more officers at the border for those who are seeking asylum. Why should we reject that? Why don't we come and find a way to stand up the infrastructure? Because a border wall that is $45 billion per inch is not going to be the only solution. I ask my colleagues to take this bill off the floor, go back to the drawing board, work with those of us in Homeland Security with all of the amendments we offered, and make a reasonable difference in the lives of Americans. And might I put back on the table, because they're all in my office all the time, the DACA recipients need a response. They are paramedics, doctors, lawyers, teachers. How dare we ignore the talent that is here that wants to be a patriotic American? I only ask for mercy. Take the bill back, help our children, make a difference, and honor the Statute of Liberty and protect the national border of this United States of America. We can do it, and it's not being done either by Texas or the United States of America. We want to do it. The people in Houston want to be humanitarians, and they want to be safe. With that, I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Mississippi reserves.
Gentleman reserves.
Thank you. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Mississippi, the Vice Chair of the Committee on Homeland Security, Mr. Guest.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I want to thank the chairman. Mr. Speaker, make no mistake, our border is broken. This administration for over 2 years has been unwilling or unable to secure our southern border. Statistics show in FY21, President Biden set a record with 1.9 million encounters. In FY22, he broke that record with 2.7 million encounters. And in FY23, President Biden is on pace to break that record once again. The numbers to my left paint a grim picture of the dire situation along our southern border. And these numbers will only grow worse as Title 42 expires. Republicans from Homeland Security, from Judiciary, from Foreign Affairs have worked together to craft legislation that will combat the border crisis, a crisis created by the failures of this administration. This legislation will hire thousands of new agents, pay retention bonuses to our frontline officers, invest in new technology, construct hundreds of miles of walls and barriers, and will support our local and state partners. Congress must fill the gap of leadership created by the inaction of this administration. We must stop the flow of illegal drugs from pouring into our communities. We must end the flood of immigrants that are coming across each and every day. We must support the hardworking men and women of law enforcement who are on the front lines of this crisis. We will not back down from this fight. and any veto threat by this president be damned, we will deliver security to the American people. With that, I urge support on this measure, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from Tennessee reserve?
Reserves.
Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Republicans want it both ways. First, they vote to reduce the number of Border Patrol agents in the field by 1,400 under their Default in America Act. And now, all of a sudden, they want to do something different. So either you're for it or you're against it, but you can't have it both ways. Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 3 minutes.
And I'd like to thank the ranking member, Mr. Thompson, for the opportunity to speak here today. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to H.R. 2. During the nearly 17 hours that the Committee on Homeland Security met to consider the border bill offered by Mr. Green, Democrats offered more than 40 amendments in order to remedy significant shortcomings in the bill. In an effort to offer new provisions to bolster operations at Customs and Border Protection and build up the fiscal year 2023 Omnibus Appropriations Act, which is what we were supposed to be going on, working on the budget that night. Under Democratic leadership, they provide over $17 billion to CBP to not only enhance port of entry operations, but also increase funding to the U.S. Border Patrol by 17%. All of the amendments were rejected by the committee Republicans. Instead of working with Democrats to provide bipartisan solutions to fix our broken immigration system, H.R. 2 is just a far-right MAGA-style immigration bill advanced by Republicans that would tear at the fabric of American values and drastically limiting asylum opportunities while doing nothing to create an orderly system. The xenophobia bill filed in this space of religious values that Republicans claim to live by. At best, H.R. 2 is a deeply distrustful effort to exploit irregular migration at the southwest border, which is expected to intensify with the termination of Title 42 health restrictions, to make political points with Donald Trump and his devoted extreme MAGA base. The hardworking civil servants who work to keep our borders secure deserve so much better. And Mr. Speaker, I urge Republicans who support detaining and deporting more migrants to take a look at Section 115C, Division A. If enacted, it would prohibit DHS from contracting with any non-governmental organizations to transport or shelter, quote, inadmissible aliens, unquote. This language would prevent ICE from being able to contract with private companies that facilitate deportations or provide detention space because they want a non-governmental organization to do it. Now, for the life of me, here we are again. You can't have it both ways. You want all of this deportation to happen, but now you're limiting the organization from doing it. You know, ironically, it seems that the child deportation...
The gentleman will suspend, please. The gentleman will suspend, please. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized. Would you like to yield more time to the gentleman from New Jersey?
Yes, I yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for another 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, just one last point. You know, ironically, it seems that the Child Deportation Act may actually undermine the extreme MAGA deportation agenda. And listening to my colleague, the ranking member from Mississippi, we've already torn children and babies away from their family. Now, it appears that we won't even help women that might be pregnant in this endeavor. I mean, how far do you want to go? And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from Mississippi reserve?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 2. We have a crisis at our southern border, and when Title 42 expires in just a few hours, that crisis will become a complete catastrophe. In an effort to play petty politics, the Biden administration and Secretary Mayorkas have traded many effective policies implemented by President Trump for chaotic, unorderly, and inhumane immigration. I arrived to the United States with my family shortly after the communist takeover of our native homeland. I understand the plight of many of those who are fleeing socialist regimes in Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua because I, too, am an exile. I, too, am an immigrant. We have legal processes already in place for people to immigrate to America legally and to solicit political asylum legally. But what the Biden administration is doing is offensive, cruel, and inhumane. Lethal fentanyl is flooding our border, killing nearly 100,000 Americans every single year. According to the New York Times, there are over 85,000 migrant children unaccounted for, and many are being subjected to forced labor and child sex trafficking. I repeat, 85,000 unaccounted for children here in the United States. I ask you, is that humane? I think not. The lack of enforcement of our border is incentivizing illegal immigration and enriching corrupt Mexican drug cartels that extort the most vulnerable. While the Biden administration endangers American people, H.R. 2 tackles the crisis head-on. This bill resumes construction of the border wall that's needed, increases the number of border agents to 22,000, increases federal grants to local law enforcement in border states, protects migrant children from human trafficking, streamlines the asylum process, and enforces background checks to bar repeat criminal offenders from re-entering our country. H.R. 2 provides a solution to the crisis that President Biden has created. Believe me, he's created it. Secretary Mayorkas and the Biden administration have failed to protect America, and our country is more dangerous than ever before. With that, I urge support of the measure, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from Tennessee reserve?
Reserve.
Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Congressional Budget Office says the Child Deportation Act would, quote, decrease the population of the United States by about 600,000 people, mostly by reducing the number of unaccompanied children present in the country, unquote. Republicans claim to be concerned about exploitation and abuse of unaccompanied children, but their answer is to slam the doors shut and deport them from the United States. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Goldman.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in opposition to H.R. 2, which is a cruel and draconian bill that demonizes asylum seekers, harms unaccompanied migrant children, and defunds programs that support nonprofit organizations and local governments that are essential to the humane processing of asylum seekers coming to our shores hoping for a better life. And in just a brief response to the gentleman from Florida, our law says that anyone crossing the border anywhere can apply for asylum. So there is no such thing as lawful asylum and unlawful asylum. And in fact, this is an area that we should address in a bipartisan way. We are in desperate need for comprehensive immigration reform. We need thoughtful and effective border security. We need more immigration judges to process asylum applicants. We need more visas for those to enter this country legally. And we need a pathway to citizenship that all of our ancestors have benefited from. But this bill is the opposite of that. It was unilaterally written by House Republicans as a partisan messaging bill with no chance of becoming law. And with this bill, Republicans are putting politics over people. In our committee, Democrats offered more than 30 amendments to try to amend and improve this bill. Every single Republican voted no on every single amendment. One even expressed shock that Democrats would dare to try to change their bill. Sadly, the Republicans rejected one of my amendments that would do more to address border security and fentanyl trafficking than anything else in this bill. An amendment to stop the massive flood of American guns to drug cartels in Mexico. Those same cartels that the chairman from Tennessee says are in control of the border. These guns give the cartels their power, it fuels the violence, and facilitates their illegal trade. Mexico has one gun shop, and it takes months of background checks to purchase a gun. But the latest estimates that we have here are that more than 500,000 American-made guns are exported to Mexico, including assault weapons of war, and many land in the hands of cartels to fuel their human and drug trafficking operation. But there isn't a single mention of guns in H.R. 2, not one. This bill is supposed to be about border security. Our border is broken, as one of my colleagues just said. Well, how can we fix the border when the cartels are ruling it with American guns? Any serious attempt to secure our borders has to address the exportation of more than 500,000 American guns per year to Mexico. But just like the gun violence
Gentleman will
epidemic
suspend. The gentleman from
that is
Mississippi
ravaging...
is recognized. Would you like to yield more time?
Yield the gentleman an additional minute.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Just like the gun violence epidemic that is ravaging our country, Republicans refuse to address the source of the problem. We need comprehensive immigration reform, meaningful solutions to address our broken immigration system, and to live up to our American values. This bill is nothing of the sort. Instead, it turns a real crisis that needs serious solutions into a political messaging tool. I therefore urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York yields. Is the gentleman from Mississippi reserved?
Yes, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Desjarlais.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman and my colleague from Tennessee. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 2. If you watch TV and listen to the administration and Secretary Mayorkas, they would tell you that the border is secure, that the border is not open. In other words, they're telling you to believe what they say and not what you see. Anybody who looks at the border can see the crisis that is there. They can look in their communities and they can see the tragedy that's unfolding with fentanyl. They can look to the sanctuary cities where all the mayors love to say, we'll take anyone, send your immigrants to our cities. Now they're screaming no more. As soon as they got a taste of what the border states are feeling and dealing with every day, they want no more part of it. The toll that this is causing our country is hard to grasp. Look no further than our SNAP program. That everyone wants to expand SNAP and make sure no one goes hungry. I agree that anyone in need should get food, but we cannot get an answer to how many people who are here illegally are on the SNAP program. We've been trying for a year. We've asked Secretary Mayorkas via letter. We've asked Secretary Vilsack via letter how many people who are here illegally or undocumented are on SNAP. We do know that 45% of non-documented households receive SNAP and only 21% of U.S. citizens receive SNAP. And when I bring this up in committee, I'm told it's very hard to get SNAP benefits if you're in the country illegally, but there are several exceptions, more than 11. Two of the main exceptions are, one, if you're under 18, you automatically qualify. We all know how many children are coming across the border. They're receiving SNAP benefits. The other is if you're seeking asylum. Well, who's coming here that is not seeking asylum? I heard the gentleman mention that anyone can claim asylum, but what we're seeing here is not true asylum seeking. It is what they're told to say because they know that's the clearest pathway into the country. And people are just simply being released in record numbers. 5-6 million people have come into our country illegally. And you know who hates illegal immigration more than any of us? People who did it right. We have the most generous immigration system in the world. Almost 1 million per year can come here legally. We're letting millions in illegally, and the people who do it right resent
time has expired.
So I urge adoption of this
30 seconds.
important.
The gentleman
Thank
is
you, Chairman.
recognized.
The
gentleman will suspend, please.
Yes, sir.
The gentleman is recognized for another 30 seconds.
I thank the Speaker. So, I urge support of this measure because we are a country of laws, and it's not right to allow your first measure in entering this country to be something illegal. And it flies in the face of all the people who did it correctly. And thank God that we have a chairman like Chairman Green who is addressing this issue. It should be a bipartisan issue. Everyone's feeling it. And it's time that we act. And I thank the Republicans for bringing this forward. It's important, and I strongly support it.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from Tennessee reserve?
Gentleman reserves.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, on March 15th, Border Patrol Chief Ortiz told the Homeland Security Committee that, quote, cartels control an awful lot of the southern border south of the United States, unquote. Last time I checked, south of the United States meant Mexico, and not 5 of 9 U.S. Border Patrol sectors. I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the gentleman from Mississippi for yielding. I rise today to discuss H.R. 2, the House Republicans' border bill that fails to fix our broken immigration system. I have been to our southern border twice since January because I do believe it is important that we experience those challenges firsthand. And despite there being an immense amount of work to do at our border, this legislation fails to meet the moment. Instead of solutions, Republicans want a wall that would immediately be obsolete upon completion and would only serve as a painful reminder of the Republicans' failed border policies. A wall that would cost almost $25 million per mile to complete, resulting in a total bill to the American taxpayers of over $11 billion. For a party that talks about wasteful government spending, how can this possibly be the best use of our taxpayer dollars? I and my colleagues on Homeland Security offered numerous amendments to this bill to address some of its core deficiencies. When I offered an amendment to strike this wasteful spending on an inefficient wall, it was rejected by every single Republican. Operation Blue Lotus, a Biden administration program, has stopped over 4,000 pounds of fentanyl from being brought into the U.S., has led to dozens of arrests and the seizure of thousands of pounds of illicit drugs. And yet, when I offered an amendment to provide congressional authorization for this successful program, it was rejected again by every single Republican. So even on the issues that Republicans talk most about, like fentanyl, this bill fails to address those challenges. And even worse, this bill treats migrants as our enemies instead of our neighbors, who are simply looking to give their families the opportunities to be hopeful about their tomorrows, to give them their fair shot at their American dream, the fair shot that all of our families were given by this country. And this bill also seeks to punish nonprofits and NGOs who, by caring for our most vulnerable neighbors, reflect the best of who we are as a country. Organizations like Catholic Charities who feed, house, and take care of migrants could lose federal funding by simply fulfilling their spiritual mission of supporting those most in need. Democrats offered amendments to ensure that NGOs would not be penalized for providing services to pregnant women, to children, to families, and each amendment failed because not a single Republican was willing to stand up and vote for it. This should not be who we are as a country. But if this bill becomes law, it will say to the world, this is who we've become. I am a no on H.R. 2, and I urge all my colleagues to do the same. I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman from Mississippi reserves. The
Mr.
gentleman
Speaker,
from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, the Speaker of the House, the United States House of Representatives, Mr. McCarthy.
The Speaker is recognized.
I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker, but I want to thank Chairman Green for his work. Mr. Green, when we took the majority and you became chairman, you didn't sit in Washington to figure out what the problem was. You actually took your committee to the border to see firsthand. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the ranking member on the other side wouldn't attend. But he stands up, speaker after speaker, thinking he knows what's happening on the border from far away of Washington. You know, I've been to the border 4 times in the past 3 years. I've seen the fear in the eyes of the ranchers who's had their property broken into. I've heard the frustration in the voice of the Border Patrol agents who are stretched to the limit. 2.5 years ago when I went to the border, I sat with the agents in El Paso. They told me they saw something different that they haven't seen before. That they were actually catching people on the terrorist watch list. I came down, I had a press conference. I announced what they told me. I would have thought, Mr. Speaker, the members on the other side of the aisle, knowing what has happened at 9/11 and others, that they would rise up in a united front to protect America. You know what I heard from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle? They said I was lying. They said they had as much security clearance as I did. That it must be not true. Because you see, in Washington, they thought they knew all, but they didn't go to the border to actually talk to the people who work right there. Interesting as though the next day, the administration had to say it was true. You know what the administration did then? Withheld the information from Congress so they could no longer find out how many people we would catch on the terrorist watch list. They wanted to deny to know what's going forward. So to my good friend on the other side of the aisle, the ranking member of Homeland Security, I'm sure you know that in the month of February, do you know that we caught more people on the terrorist watch list in this 1 month, in the last entire time of the last administration? In the last administration, 4 years of everybody that came across on the terrorist watch list, this February, more came across. I'm sure from the far away, you might probably think that's not true too. You know, I felt the sorrows in the words of the mothers and fathers who lost their children to fentanyl. You know what? You can stay in Washington if you want, and you will still hear the sorrows of the mothers and the fathers. Today alone, 300 Americans will be poisoned by fentanyl. 300. It's the equivalent of an airline crashing each and every day in America. I don't hear you rising up. Every day, 300. They come from all walks of life. But you want to stand and you want to say no to H.R. 2? I want you to look to the parents in the eyes of their young children. Because they didn't buy fentanyl when they died. They were at college. They bought Xanax. And it doesn't just happen to you think the kids, maybe in the partying or others. You know, just last year on spring break, 6 kids OD'd in Florida. They didn't belong to a fraternity. They went to West Point. They didn't buy fentanyl. They all didn't take the cocaine. 4 of them did. The other 2 simply gave them mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. But you know what? Vote no. Go ahead, vote no. But if you won't lead, we will. If you want to take the same approach as the president, that you want to ignore a problem and say it's not happening, we won't sit back. We don't sit back in Washington. We go to the border to actually see what's going on. We listen, we learn, and then we sit in committee. Even though your committee went and had a hearing, I'm sure you're very proud. You protested, you didn't go. Who lost? More Americans lost. More Americans will die by your actions. For their sake and for our nation's safety, we must secure our border. This is President Biden's record on the border. Record crossings, record carelessness, record chaos. More than 11,000 people were caught yesterday crossing the border illegally. The highest single-day total ever. But I look forward to hearing what the ranking member's quote is coming forward. Maybe he'll quote the secretary that the border's secure. Believe him, you're sitting in Washington. And what will the administration's plan for these 11,000? According to NBC News, the plan, it's brilliant. Listen to it. It's to release many of them into the United States. No court dates, no way to track them. Because that worked so well in the past. Just ask the 85,000 children the Biden administration lost. I look forward to hearing the other side get up and tell me why they're voting no. Because they don't want to find these 85,000? Don't take my word for it. This comes from the New York Times. Tomorrow, as you sit here and debate and fight to make sure the border is still wide open, Title 42 expires. Everyone knows we are days away from disaster. The mayor of El Paso, which recently declared a state of emergency, says there's no light at the end of the tunnel. We are preparing for the unknown. The governor of Arizona says President Biden has been unresponsive. And Governor Abbott of Texas rightly pointed out this is not a Texas problem. This is a problem for the entire United States. You know, I heard President Biden say yesterday that lifting Title 42 means it's going to be chaotic for a little while. With all due respect, Mr. President, it's been chaotic for the 2 years because of your actions. When President Biden took office, on the very day he decided against the advice of the border security experts to single-handedly remove the successful border policies of the previous administrations. The first thing President Biden did, he stopped construction of the border wall. He spends money now just to house the equipment and materials. He halted deportations. He ended Remain in Mexico, and he called for amnesty for millions of people who broke the law. His actions sent a clear message to the world, including the cartels. The border is open. I remember on one of my trips down to the border right after the president took office, we had a new facility built, and they hit that day a record number that the facility, they thought they'd never make capacity, but they did. And as we walked in, we interviewed those who were standing in line, and we asked them, why did they come? They said, President Biden told us to. He told us the border was open. We asked, how long was the stretch? Weeks, months. But the president invited us. The world listened, and the cartels acted. To this day, the southern border is flooded by illegal aliens from more than 140 countries. Like Yemen, Russia, China, and others. Yet how has this administration responded? A responsible administration would have told the American people in clear terms, this is a crisis. But the Biden administration tells the public that there is no crisis. Rather than leveling with the American people, the Biden administration is choosing to mislead them. I don't know if the ranking leader has ever been to Tucson, Arizona, but I was there recently. You know, in Tucson, Arizona, the cartels control the border. Every single person who comes across that border is wearing a camouflage outfit. On their feet and on their shoes is a piece of rug. 71% who come across that border are single males. They don't run up to the border agents. They run from them. It's one of the highest areas of getaways. It's a large terrain. Every day, Americans risk their lives to go rescue people on the cliffs that have fallen. We took balloons up so we could actually calculate who's coming across. When this became such a reported case, you know what the Biden administration did? They cut the number of balloons. You know why? Because they said the numbers will go down. That's how they want to deal with it. They want to lie to the American public. There's no better example than Secretary Mayorkas' comments that the border is secure. Mr. Speaker, I hope the ranking member gets up after me, and I would like him to answer one question. Does he believe, Secretary Mayorkas, that the border is secure? You've been chairman. You're ranking now. I'm sure sometime you went to the border, but not when your committee did, not when we wanted to work on this bill. You wanted to protest. You wanted to not go because you could learn everything you needed from right here in Washington, maybe from the secretary. I'd like to know how many of you who stand up and say you're going to vote against H.R. 2 believe Secretary Mayorkas. Do you believe the border is secure? Just honestly tell us. Tell the American public if that's what you believe. Everyone knows that isn't true. You can't say the border is secure when more than 4.5 million people have crossed our border illegally in the 24 months since President Biden has taken office. There's not one piece of legislation has changed from one administration to the other. The only thing that changed was the president. And what did President Biden do? He lifted all the actions that President Trump and President Obama. And that's what happened to our border. You can't say the border is secure when more than 175 individuals on the terrorist watch list have tried to cross our border. You can't say the border is secure when human trafficking has grown into a multi-billion-dollar business for the cartels. You can't say the border is secure when you don't control the border and when the number one employer in some of these border towns is the cartel. You can't say the border is secure when I sit there with mayors. They happen to be from the other party. And they tell me the personal stories that their daughter called. And he told her not to go outside because there was a car chase. A car chase because a cartel hired a young American to drive somebody they put across. The car was going through, and it's not an unusual thing. It happens often. Schools there, they would tell me, had to close 45 days. But this car chase ended like others. Killed an innocent American. This innocent American was going to a retirement party. 65 years old grandmother. Going to have her friends celebrate a life of work, looking forward to the times with all the work and investment she put in to spend with her grandchildren and travel. But no, her life was taken from her. And the secretary said our border is secure. If you would travel to these towns, you would know this too. If you'd spend the time, you'd understand. You see, many of those elected officials aren't Republicans. They're Americans. They're registered as Democrats. And they say they're disgusted by what this administration is doing. But while the Biden administration is missing in actions, House Republicans are going to take action. We spent 2 years listening to those who have lived through the border crisis. Border Patrol agents, ranchers, families, businesses, and local leaders. When I was in Tucson, I sat with a rancher. He's told me he's found 5 dead bodies on his ranch. His grandson 7 years old, found one just last year. This is human life. 52 died in a tractor trailer. I sat with one, told me the story when he looked down the road, saw 3 young children. One not even 1, the other 3, and the other 4. Had the rancher not found them, they wouldn't be alive. What about those who don't make it? What about those who don't pay the cartels? I sat with one news covering agent, told the story of a woman who didn't pay the cartels. So the cartels took her life. They didn't just take her life, they wanted to show it to everybody in the world. So they strung her body up in a tree, cut her legs off, put her on fire. You see, if you go to the border, you'll learn these stories. You'll actually know what's happening there. So I don't think you'd take a partisan position. You wouldn't talk in talking points. You'd actually believe if 4.5 million people in the last year came across, if 11,000 came across yesterday, Title 42 is going to be lifted. If you don't like our bill, what's your answer? What's your plan? What are you going to do? As I promised, we brought their government to them, visiting the border, gathering facts, and holding hearings. What we learned directly from informed not only our commitment to America, but also the Secure the Border Act. Here's what this bill does. It fully provides for the effective border enforcement policies, infrastructure, and advanced technology. It increases the number of Border Patrol agents and gives them the bonus pay they deserve. It ends catch and release and strengthens current laws to protect unaccompanied children from the human traffickers. I hope everybody who votes no reads the New York Times. I hope you read the stories about these young children. It reinstates the so-called Remain in Mexico provisions. And it resumes construction of the border wall because the border wall works. The Secure the Border Act is the strongest border security bill to come through Congress in more than 100 years. If it passes, I'm confident that we will stop the flood of fentanyl into our country, solve the Biden border crisis, and support our Border Patrol agents so they can continue to keep us safe. Fentanyl is the #1 killer of Americans between the ages of 18 and 45. If anybody thinks about their life between the ages of 18 and 45, those are the years you reproduce. Those are your most productive years in business. Those are the years of those who volunteer to serve in the military, defend our freedom. And right now, the most productive population age in our country is being killed. But I listen to the other side, they're going to say, no, continue it. By the actions of this president, Mr. Ranking Member, you don't have to go to the border because now every city is a border city. You see, in my hometown of Bakersfield, in elementary school, father registered his son just after Thanksgiving. School district, public school, did a really good job. They noticed in 2 days this boy had an issue. They didn't sit back. They went to his house. They met with his father. They said, we feel your son has a challenge learning in others, and we want to work with you. We want to help him. Literally went to his house in 2 days. They watched him as they came to school, but you know what he did when he came to school? He walked over to a vape room. He had a backpack, and he came into the class. They looked in the backpack. He had 150 pills. This kid's not even 16 years old. I think he was only 12. The counselor took out the pill to see what it was. They had to call an ambulance because the counselor touched the fentanyl pill. I'm far from the border. Just up the road in my district, they pulled over a car. I believe it was more than 500,000 fentanyl pills. California law, you couldn't ask the individuals if they were citizens, and they weren't. I can't tell you how much jail time they got, because in California, they believe in a lot of your policies. And so the person didn't even have to have bail. They both got a ticket, told to show back up. They never did. They probably got back in the car, delivered more of those fentanyl pills coming across the border. And some of those 300 Americans that die today, I'm not sure if one of those pills were theirs. But I do know this. Tomorrow, when I cast a yes vote for H.R. 2, we're doing something to stop the fentanyl. We're doing something for those families. We're doing something for the next generation of America. If you believe in a rule of law as one of the greatest strengths of this nation, you cannot keep it if you have millions of people who break it by entering it. There's no nation as generous as America. 1 million people will become citizens this year. 1 million more next year. We're different than any other nation. But what we have today is something that we don't even control, our own operation of our borders. I urge all my colleagues to vote yes on Secure the Border Act. Vote yes on security over chaos, and vote yes to stop the fentanyl killing our children. With that, I yield back.
Members are reminded to address the remarks through the chair and not to each other in the second person. The gentleman from Tennessee reserves.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at some point, you have to correct the record. You know, we had a debt ceiling budget vote several weeks ago. The Republican approved debt ceiling budget would cut the DHS budget by 22%. So you can't be for something, but you don't invest in what you say you're for. I'll step back a little further and say that if Republicans are really serious about border security, they would have joined Democrats in passing last year's government funding bill. It provided more than $17 billion to Customs and Border Protection alone, and a 17% increase in the Border Patrol budget. But unfortunately, Speaker McCarthy voted against that too. Democrats have been to the border. I took 9 members in April of this year to the border. We talked to a lot of people. I've been on the committee quite a while. I've gone to the border in a number of times to see. So one visit you didn't go to is not the end of the world. I was on the border before the Speaker was in Congress. So there's history here that we just need to make sure that we all understand. Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to say that most of my life I've lived on both sides of the border. And since taking over my subcommittee this year, I've gone to, last 4 months, Laredo, Brownsville, Yuma, El Centro, San Isidro, Otay, and just Monday, Otay, Tijuana, Mexico. I'm doing this because I think it's important that we leave Washington and go and ask the border agents, go ask the port authorities what's going on. Tell me what you need. Saw these men and women in blue uniforms at our ports of entry. They're very proud of their work, and they said, Lou, look, this is 99% of the trade we have. the integration of the North American markets. We are making that happen thanks to the investments by Congress in personnel, technology, and infrastructure. Then they said, but we have to keep out that 1%, that fentanyl, those narcotics. And they proudly said, we here, the ports of entry, are responsible for stopping 90% of the fentanyl that comes into this country. And I asked them, of course, what do you need to do your job better? They said, we are looking to you in Washington for more support. We're 2,400 personnel down, CBP agents, and they said, your proposals here by my colleagues on the other side do nothing to support the additional hiring of men and women in blue uniforms. Those blue uniforms are responsible for stopping 95% of the fentanyl that's coming across the border. I proposed amendments to this legislation for better pay, retention, child care. For those workers, they have to do forced overtime. All my amendments were turned down. If we are serious about stopping fentanyl, we have to invest more in those blue uniforms, and this legislation does absolutely nothing to do that. Let's be frank here, folks. I've also gone to farmers and small businesses in my district, and they're also very scared. They're scared from becoming criminals. You put in a mandatory E-Verify, and every one of those farmers that employ undocumented farm workers is going to be criminalized. Every one of those small businesses in my district that is calling me and saying, Lou, we need immigration reform, they will also become criminals because they employ undocumented. We seem to forget we have a 3.6% unemployment rate in this country. Those folks that are coming across the border, they're disappearing into the fabric of our economic society. They're getting jobs. They are working. They're part of our fabric. Unless we have immigration reform, unless we have a way to get workers into this country that's teamed up with some of these proposals, it's not going to work. At the end of the day, the private sector that needs workers,
Expired.
folks that need a job, we'll figure out how to make it work.
Mr. Speaker, I yield an additional minute to the Speaker.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional minute.
Mr. Speaker, this bill is not enough. This bill is not about solving a solution. It's simply messaging. You're not addressing the fentanyl problem. The best investment are where you know it will be stopped at the border. You're not addressing the employment issue in every sector of our economy, in every state in our union. We need workers. We don't need to criminalize, make employers criminal for trying to hire somebody to harvest this crop. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, and I yield.
And from Mississippi reserves.
Gentleman reserves.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. D'Esposito, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act. And I must say that I find it, Mr. Speaker, quite comical and a little bit scary that we just heard that this bill is nothing more than, quote, messaging. Because when I was sitting in this seat, I was wondering for a moment if we were debating a bill or having some juvenile partisan contest about how many times we could say MAGA and extreme, which have nothing to do with this bill. What is extreme, however, is the unprecedented levels of illegal migrants, fentanyl, and other deadly drugs that have come across our open border. This week, Title 42 ends, and we still have heard no plan from the White House on how they plan to deal with the levels of illegal migrants that continue daily to travel across our southern border. House Republicans are delivering where President Biden refuses to. The Secure the Border Act will help us regain operational control of the border, combat illegal immigration, and stop fentanyl smugglers. This legislation will support the brave men and women serving as members of the Border Patrol by hiring an additional 22,000 Border Patrol agents. This hiring blitz will allow Border Patrol agents to return to their law enforcement mission in the field and not simply act as processing coordinators. We will be providing incentives, solidifying institutional knowledge, and help with the mass exodus caused by the dereliction of duty of Secretary Mayorkas. Additionally, this bill will end controversial catch-and-release policy, which puts migrants into communities while awaiting their hearings. The Secure the Border Act will also increase transparency over federal government and strengthen current law to protect unaccompanied children at the border from human trafficking. We've heard about these amendments. There were amendments about a border that we were told by Democrats was secure.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
And instead of focusing on our border, these amendments focused on challenge coins, climate change, and about moments in a news cycle. Well, to my friends on the other side of the aisle, that news cycle is devastating to many. Devastating to those who have now been at the hands of the cartel. Devastated to those who have lost children and grandchildren to fentanyl. And while the Biden administration is ignoring the safety and security of our county and our country, House Republicans are delivering on our commitment to a nation that is safe. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Tennessee reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the extreme MAGA Republican Default on America Act, which the last speaker voted for, would result in CBP not being able to seize nearly 900 pounds of fentanyl because of the draconian cuts to its budget. I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the gentleman for yielding time. Now, I rise today in strong opposition to this un-American and cruel bill. Now, I immigrated to this country as a small child, and I love our country for all it has provided me and my family. Immigrants love this country. They dedicate their lives to working, and they make our community stronger. This bill does not uphold our values as a nation. A bill that was true to those values would uplift and celebrate the contributions of immigrants. Real patriots know that love of country is actually about helping people. And let's be crystal clear. We all want a safe and secure border. And the best way to achieve that is through comprehensive immigration reform and creating legal pathways for people who want to come here to work. Sadly, this bill does not do that. Instead, it doubles down on a failed anti-immigrant agenda. This bill guts the fundamental right to seek asylum. It strips protections for unaccompanied children, and it wastes more money on Donald Trump's pointless border wall, a monument to hate which does nothing to protect us. Now, in the Homeland Security Committee, I helped lead the fight against harmful provisions of this bill that target nonprofits who partner with our border agencies for care and for our asylum seekers. But House Republicans are moving ahead with these disastrous policies that would require charities to check the immigration status of those who need care, even in a crisis. By defunding nonprofits, this cold-hearted bill would ignore what the gospel teaches us. It ignores our brothers and sisters who are tired, poor, hungry, and sick. Those who need the most in their time of need. If this bill ever becomes law, it would cause chaos and suffering. We need real immigration reform, and America is ready for that debate. Let's rise to the occasion and create an America that reflects kindness and centers on helping people. Being anti-immigrant is being anti-American. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Mississippi reserves.
Gentleman reserves.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I recognize for 3 minutes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Strong.
Gentleman from Alabama recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act. This legislation is the culmination of months of hard work and collaboration of 3 House committees, Homeland Security, of which I serve as a member, Judiciary, and Foreign Affairs. It represents what is possible when we work together for the good of our nation. In my very first floor speech as a member of Congress, I echoed the concerns and fears I've heard from the constituents that I represent and what I've seen firsthand at the southern border. Americans are not safe, and our country is under attack at the southern border. Illegal immigration, drug runners, and human smugglers continue to exploit this administration's open southern border policy as this administration looks the other way. This last weekend, in just 72 hours, Border Patrol apprehended over 26,000 migrants, had approximately 7,500 gotaways, and seized 11 pounds of fentanyl, enough to kill 2.5 million Americans. If this is what operational control looks like to this administration, it's no wonder why Americans are worried. Title 42 is set to expire tomorrow, bringing not a surge, but an invasion of illegal immigrants that our communities, hospitals, schools, and law enforcement officials simply can't handle. This debacle created by this administration has not seen its worst day. Just this morning, the administration released a statement outlining how they plan to deal with this incoming invasion. The Department of Homeland Security press release says they have finalized a rule to incentivize the use of lawful immigration pathways. They are choosing to incentivize illegal immigrants to follow our laws when we should be punishing those that don't follow our laws. The fact is, President Trump's border policies work for America. Now more than ever, we must pass this legislation and move toward a lawful, safe, secure, and orderly border. We don't have time to waste. Among many important provisions, this legislation would grant DHS authority to suspend entry and gain operational control of the border, similar to Title 42. I'm pleased to stand here today with my colleagues in support of this legislation that begins to address the massive failure of this administration. H.R. 2 reflects Republicans' commitment to make America safer. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. It is up to us to stop this invasion of America at the southern border because no one else will. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Tennessee reserves. Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, on February 1st, the last speaker voted against the public health emergency that served as the legal basis for the use of Title 42 at the southwest border. My colleagues want to have it both ways, which is why I guess he supports H.R. 2, the Child Deportation Act. I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, the ranking member of the Natural Resources Committee.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank the gentleman from Mississippi for yielding. I happen to represent every border community and every port of entry along the Arizona-Mexico border. My home, I grew up, and that's where I live, and that's where I've lived, is in those borderlands. I don't need a photo op tour for me to understand, to feel, and to respect the fact that these communities and this area of our nation has been left behind, not just by policy, by intent. H.R. 2 is not serious legislation to address our urgent need to fix our broken immigration system and to respond to the pending humanitarian crisis on our border, to combat the deadly flow of fentanyl and human exploitation by organized crime syndicates. It won't do that. But what H.R. 2 will do, it will devastate our affordable food supply by eliminating up to half the workforce in agriculture, farming, and ranching. It will dramatically increase the economic hardship of border communities and the borderlands. It will fund the Trump Memorial Wall, a piece of useless government waste. It will demonize children and unaccompanied youth, and it will provide Republicans with the fundraising tools, and it will also provide them with a means to create division, fear, and chaos in preparation for the 2024 elections. My Republican colleagues hope that voters will overlook their growing extremism and their failure to deal with real issues in this Congress, one of them being immigration. The lifting of Title 42 challenges Republicans in this House to do more than political posturing. And yes, indeed, challenges the Biden administration not to allow the pending humanitarian crisis to become desperate and punitive. I want to also take a little historic look and remind the body of the schizophrenic anti-immigrant underpinnings of H.R. 2. The echoes of past immigration debates in this chamber are with us today, and let me quote from the congressional record. In 1884, Congressman Henley of California spoke on the floor on the need to preserve a white man's government from dark and yellow-skinned people. In 1924, Congressman Wilson of Louisiana said, "Two things are certain. One is that America cannot exist with a large percentage of mongrel communities with different views and aspirations." That same year, Representative Robinson of Kentucky said, "Let us send out the slackers and undesirables. Let us clean up America and keep America clean for the real Americans and for the real country." And I mentioned those historical realities and facts from previous debates to underline the point that H.R. 2 must not be a means to grow the worst native impulses that we might have in this Congress, or to accept ethnic and racial prejudices.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentleman another minute.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional minute.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. All to further and to accept ethnic and racial prejudices as criteria in our immigration laws and policies, bringing to life those echoes of the past. The values and the common ground that must be found in order to effectively deal with the issue of immigration, with the issue of asylum seekers and refugee seekers, requires real solutions. It requires humanitarian relief, but it also requires an enforcement focus that deals with the issues that have been talked about by the other side: fentanyl, the drug running, human exploitation. But it also requires that all of us in Congress, and particularly those that represent the borderlands, be included in those discussions to the point that we can bring the real voices, the real impulses, and the real needs of those communities, and not treat H.R. 2 must be defeated because it is against our values and it promotes a mythology that everything that happens on that southern border is bad, unhealthy, criminal, and un-American. That is wrong.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Mississippi reserves.
Gentleman reserved.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from the state of Georgia, Ms. Green.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to remind everyone that Republicans believe in legal immigration. As a matter of fact, we're very proud of our former First Lady, Melania Trump, who immigrated legally to the United States. But there's a clear difference in policies when we talk about border and security for the United States of America. And I think it's very important to remind my colleagues across the aisle what our oath of office actually says. We swear an oath that we will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that is a very important oath to swear, and it's one to uphold. But this is not being upheld. In the past 2 years under this administration, we have seen nearly 5 million people cross our border, and it's unsustainable. As a matter of fact, on Monday, a record was set for border apprehensions. And then just yesterday, that record was defeated because they had even more border apprehensions. 2 records. I don't even know what today is yet. We don't have the numbers, but soon we'll know. But the clear difference between Democrats and Republicans when we talk about border security and we talk about these policies is that Democrats don't serve Americans, they serve migrants, and they serve foreign countries and their borders, but not Americans, American tax dollars, and America's border. As a matter of fact, according to the Border Patrol chief, 5 out of the 9 sectors are out of control and in the hands of the cartels. But yet the most important thing to Democrats across the aisle is attacking the Second Amendment and taking away Americans' guns because they're claiming that'll keep Americans safe from the cartels. That's insanity. Democrats serve migrants so much that they're interested in bringing more into the country. When they talk about hiring more Border Patrol agents, it's because they want Border Patrol agents to be the welcoming committee. But H.R. 2, which I strongly support, hires more Border Patrol agents and gives them bonuses so that they can do the job that they were hired to do, which is to protect our southern border. And by the way, the lives of migrants who are dying nearly every single day as they try to cross our border. You know, it's really interesting. Unfortunately, this administration and Democrats serve migrants so much more than Americans, and it seems that Biden serves any country that's willing to write them a check as long as they make it out payable to the Biden family LLCs. How about that? Title 42 lifts tomorrow.
This time is expired.
Tomorrow. I yield back.
Reserve. Tennessee Reserve. Members are reminded to direct their against personalities against the president. Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, if Republicans were serious about border security, they would have joined Democrats in passing last year's government funding bill, which paid for an increase of 300 Border Patrol agents, the first increase since the Obama administration. And not only did the last speaker not support it, she voted to have 1,400 Border Patrol agents fewer in the field under the extreme mega Republican Default on America Act. I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Thanador.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member Mr. Thompson. Mr. Speaker, I stand here today as a symbol of what our immigration system can achieve. In 1979, at the age of 24, I entered this country alone, with no friends, no family, but I had my American dream. At times, I slept in a car or at a homeless shelter that was funded by a faith-based nonprofit. At times, I got sick and needed to go to the hospital. H.R. 2 would cut funding for these nonprofit organizations and remove reimbursement system for immigrants to get health care. So when my colleagues on the other side of the aisle ask me why I don't support this bill, my answer is simple. I don't support cutting programs that help me and help immigrants like me in times of their need and their hardship. I stand with countless immigrants who have contributed greatly to our country and urge opposition to H.R. 2. When my colleagues and I went down to the southern border, we met with many nonprofit organizations and saw the important and necessary work that they do. We met with the border agents and learned that they are working with a broken immigration system. Reforming this system is going to be complex, but the Republicans are proposing an enforcement-only strategy. This is not going to work. I propose that we expand legal pathways, restore asylum systems, work with nonprofit organizations like the ones that housed me and cared for me when I was just arriving to this country. Mr. Speaker, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Mississippi reserves.
Gentleman reserve.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
As a quick correction of the record, the bill doesn't do anything to take away health care services provided by NGOs, just to clarify that. Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from my home state and my friend, Mr. Ogles.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2. I want to thank all of those who have worked on this important and signature piece of legislation. I specifically want to point out and thank my friend and colleague from Tennessee, Chairman Congressman Mark Green. Mr. Speaker, Lennox Lake, 6 years old, killed by an illegal. Sarah Root, 21, killed by an illegal. Maris DiGiovanni, killed by an illegal. Jacqueline Vigil, 55, murdered by a man who'd been deported on multiple occasions. Retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Jerry Wayne Harbor, 75, killed by an illegal. Joseph G.T. Paglia, retired police officer, 48, killed by an illegal. Michael White, retired U.S. Army officer, killed by an illegal. These are just a few of the individuals and countless Americans who have been murdered at the hands of illegal aliens. Though a porous border has long been a problem, what once was a trickle is now a flood. And this administration, who has overseen, is responsible for 10 consecutive months of over 200,000 apprehensions. This crisis is the fault of this president, so long as he refuses to enact policies to secure our border. Our border crisis is literally killing Americans. It's threatening the safety of communities and is costing at least $151 billion every single year in de facto subsidies for those who break our laws. As we approach the end of Title 42, it is imperative that we take action to secure our border and stop the flood of illegal aliens. The House Republicans' bill, the Secure Border Act of 2023, will force Biden to restart the construction of the wall. It increased Border Patrol agents, requires transparency from the DHS, and ends the practice of catch and release, and it strengthens the asylum process. Again, I want to thank Homeland Security Chairman and my fellow friend, Tennessean and Congressman Mark Green. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Tennessee reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 2 squeezes Customs and Border Patrol officers working at ports of entry by failing to provide resources to cover the increased workload that will result from the bill. If Republicans were serious about border security, they would have joined Democrats in passing last year's government funding bill, which appropriated $60 million to hire an additional 125 CBP officers. Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Clark.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I thank you, Ranking Member Thompson. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the GOP's extreme and punitive immigration legislation, H.R. 2, also known as the Child Deportation Act. This cruel legislation would force draconian restrictions and punishments on migrants and asylum seekers and set America's immigration priorities back 4 years. At the cost of $6.1 billion, this bill would eliminate the right to asylum in America, a process millions upon millions have enjoyed over the generations. Vulnerable, desperate people and families have long depended on these laws for their safety and future. Moreover, it would affect the legal system of over 4 million people who would otherwise be granted parole or asylum. Instead of fostering immigration that strengthens our economy and empowers its growth, Republicans would rather throw our economy into a tailspin. So let's be clear. Any bill that would allow vulnerable migrant children to be inhumanely detained by Border Patrol for up to a month, to be ripped from their families and locked up from the world is unacceptable. And it is fundamentally un-American. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. I need not remind you, Mr. Speaker, what those words adorn, nor what they represent. To treat vulnerable people fleeing violence, famine, and persecution, who are looking for a better life in our nation with such contempt, such vitriol, such callousness, it's not leadership, it's cowardice. Though I am the daughter of Jamaican immigrants and know the struggles and challenges immigrant communities confront every day, my unique perspective on this issue is not really it should be irrelevant. Every American, no matter how long their families have called this country their own, should be outraged at a GOP that would codify migrant children abuse. And make no mistake, regardless of H.R. 2's fate, America's immigration system is massively broken. The glaring inequities, blatant racism, vicious xenophobia, and civil rights violations immigrants face, particularly in immigrant communities of color, will persist beyond any one bill. As the federal government ends its use of Title 42 and Democrats work to increase investments in border safety and personnel, open more lawful pathways, and begin to address root causes of migration, it is beyond time for Congress to pass
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Yield the gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you. It is beyond time for Congress to pass immigration policy that reflects humane, equitable, and 21st century immigration system. We are a nation of immigrants founded by immigrants, so we must do better for immigrants. And I will always stand against the limitless cruelty that has become synonymous with the MAGA movement and the cruelty they espouse. Thank you. With that, I yield back.
The lady yields back. Gentleman from Mississippi reserves.
Gentleman reserves.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, again, I'm compelled to correct the record. The bill very specifically states that family units will be kept together. There'll be no separation of children. It very clearly is stated in the bill. And with that, I yield 4 minutes to my good friend, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
Gentleman is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the chairman. And Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of all Texans and all Americans whose lives have been put at risk by the untenable crisis at our southern border. Let's just look at the numbers. In the 2 years that this president has been in office, there have been over 5 million encounters at the southern border, 1.4 million gotaways, and countless numbers of people who matched not only the terror watch list, but also criminal organization. That totals nearly 6.5 million people. And to put that in perspective, that's bigger than over 33 states in the United States. Among those 5 million, our Border Patrol have caught nearly 200 unsuspected terrorists trying to cross into our country illegally. This should not only concern every American, but it also outrages Americans who want law and order and safety to be considered. What I'm even more concerned about is how many among the 1.4 million gotaways would match that list that we don't know about. This is something that I have been sounding the alarm bells in my entire time in Congress, something that unfortunately my Democrat colleagues have buried their heads in the sand and refused to address for the last 2 years. I could continue talking about the terrible numbers all day, about the 15,000 criminals arrested, the 14,000 pounds of fentanyl that have been seized, which, by the way, is enough to kill 3 billion people, and that's just in the last 6 months. But I want to turn the focus of today's discussion about border security back to the tragedies, the human tragedies that are affecting every district, including mine. Americans like Elisa Tambunga, whose 7-year-old daughter and 71-year-old grandmother were tragically killed by human traffickers doing 105 miles an hour with 11 illegal immigrants in the back seat who hit their car and instantly killed them. They're the victims. Children like the 700 unaccompanied migrants. You want to talk about children who have been displaced and separated? These 700 unaccompanied migrants who were dropped off in Midland, Texas, trafficked by traffickers away from their parents, dropped off in the middle of the night. They are victims. What about fathers like Joe Warnick of Odessa, Texas, who found his 17-year-old son dead after taking a pill laced with fentanyl? He's a victim, along with 110,000 Americans last year who lost their lives to fentanyl. Or the 53 migrants who died in the sweltering heat in the back of a tractor trailer south of San Antonio, Texas last year. They're the victims. These are real people. This is not just a border crisis. This is a national security emergency. Texans demand a solution, and today I'm proud to join my colleagues in supporting H.R. 2, the Secure Border Act of 2023. The timing of this legislation could not be more precise. With the ending of Title 42, our bill will force the administration to restart construction of the border wall. It will deploy much-needed technology to the border. It will increase border agents and give them the well-deserved bonuses that they need to maintain their services. Several of my original provisions have been included in this package that will require the administration to own up to the total number of known gotaways or known and suspected terrorists crossing the border each month, as well as outline the costs that are incurred by states like Texas. Mr. President, how many more lives will be lost? How many more will it take to take action? That's why Republicans are not ignoring this crisis. We are taking action. We are restoring the security of our border. And I'm extremely proud to stand here with Chairman Mark Green and his efforts and Speaker McCarthy to pass a bill that will finally secure the border and do what Americans put us here to do. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. The gentleman from Tennessee reserves.
Reserves.
Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 2 does nothing to combat illicit narcotics like fentanyl. If Republicans were serious about border security, they would have joined Democrats in passing last year's government funding bill, which provided $70 million for intrusive inspection technology at ports of entry where most dangerous drugs are interdicted. I now yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Salinas.
Lady from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 2. My dad immigrated to the United States from Mexico when he was just a child. He picked cotton and tomatoes in the Rio Grande Valley before eventually earning his U.S. citizenship. Today, his daughter is a member of the United States Congress and serves on the Agriculture Committee, a true testament to the unique power and promise of the American dream. Migrant workers like my dad are the work engine of our agriculture industry today. That's a fact, maybe an inconvenient one for some of my colleagues, but a fact nonetheless. By some estimates, immigrant farm workers make up more than 70% of agricultural workers in the U.S. Nearly 175,000 immigrant farm workers reside in Oregon alone. Their work is backbreaking, exhausting, and at times life-threatening, yet they show up, rain or shine, heat dome or ice storm, to feed America, to do the work. Not red states or blue states, but every state. And that's why I'm completely stunned by the arrogance and short-sightedness of the majority. Are you so blinded by xenophobia that you're willing to endanger not only our food security, but our national security with e-verify requirements that even members of your own party call a mistake? Democrats did offer an amendment to strike the e-verify provision, but the majority defeated that amendment. Oh my goodness. So I am hoping that you can think beyond spinning your way out of the reality that this bill will decimate our agriculture industry. The American people are smarter than that, and they will see through these political games. Turning employers into enforcers will result in nothing less than the collapse of our agriculture system, and with it, our ability to feed our great nation. It would be a willful error of the highest magnitude, something the American people will never forgive or forget. Empty fields, empty tables, empty bellies. That is what H.R. 2 would do, and that is why we must all be a no vote. I yield back.
Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Mississippi reserves.
Gentleman reserves.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I inquire how much time remains on each side?
The gentleman from Tennessee has 28.25 minutes. The gentleman from Mississippi has 17.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman, the American hero, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Luttrell.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak in support of H.R. 2, the Secure Border Act. Now, America is facing a crisis on our northern, southern, and maritime borders. Our nation has witnessed a devastating effect of disastrous open border policies. To date, from the past 2 years, over 5 million people have come into this country. That is more than the Louisiana and Mississippi population combined. In my district, every day, I have to face the families that have lost their babies from fentanyl. A few weeks ago in San Jacinto County, a known cartel member who was extradited from, who was taken out of the country, ended up murdering 5 innocent people in one of my counties. Now, thankfully, local law enforcement, FBI, state troopers, and BORTAC caught that bastard. These are the problems that we should not have. Now, Mr. Speaker, we are criticized on this side of the aisle for our immigration policies, about DACA, where the funding's going. Well, I asked my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, you had 2 years to fix DACA. Where were you at? You had 2 years to fund ports of entry. Where were you at? You sent money elsewhere. We are criticized about this bill, which is a step in the right direction, which starts to move and solve the problem. My colleagues on the other side, I ask you, where have you been? We showed up. We came here to Congress in order to fix this problem. We pushed this legislation across, and all you can do is criticize. That's unacceptable. With that, I yield back.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Tennessee reserves. Thank you. And the gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, while the imposition of a nationwide E-Verify on all businesses found in this bill is not in the Homeland Security Division, it still affects me as a member of Congress from a rural part of the country. I cannot overstate how damaging this language is to agricultural labor in my district. Many of my rural Republican colleagues know this too. To put it bluntly, if enacted, this bill will force American farmers to go out of business. Mr. Speaker, I also ask unanimous consent to submit letters of opposition against the Child Deportation Act from the AFL-CIO, SEIU, Service Employees International Union, Agricultural Workforce Coalition.
Without objection.
With that, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Sorensen.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in opposition to H.R. 2. For years and years, politicians have kicked immigration reform down the road over and over and over again. For future generations, they'll address it. Unfortunately, the bill that we have today that we're considering, it just continues the trend. Our border must be secure. Make no mistake, we have to do everything that we can to prevent harmful drugs like fentanyl from destroying the lives of our kids and our families. But we need real solutions. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle want to solve our border crisis. But the bill in front of us today would only make our border less secure. The bill in front of us today does nothing to address the root causes of our system's backlog and only serves to gut our asylum ability, denying the protection to the people who need it the most. Gutting the few remaining pathways to claim asylum, kicking dreamers out of the only country that they've ever known, it just accelerates the chaos and the extremism. And in the end, all it does is harm our neighbors and our communities. Like many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I support smart, targeted investments in border security and providing law enforcement the resources that they need to end the flow of weapons and fentanyl into our country. Speaker McCarthy just spoke about the dangerous people that were just caught this year. But I proposed an amendment that would have hired an additional 500 Customs and Border Protection officers at ports of entry to screen more people at the border. And another amendment that I provided would allow $50 million to expand a task force to go after fentanyl distributors. But you know what? Speaker McCarthy and every Republican refused to consider these amendments into the committee, ideas that have bipartisan support. Listen, the story of America, it's a story of immigrants, opportunity, and hard work. We have to push back against legislation that sows division and chaos. Let's come together to create an immigration system that works, that protects our dreamers and treats migrants humanely, ensuring that our hometowns are safe from drugs and crime. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Mississippi reserves.
Gentleman reserves.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I hear from my colleagues across the aisle the accusations that the legislation that's before us today is somehow xenophobic. I want to remind my colleagues that the number of countries of people who are appearing at our southern border breaking our laws are from over 140 countries. Every single race, every single religion, almost all the nationalities of the world. This bill is about law and order. It is not xenophobic. I recall myself when I was there on the border, not my last, maybe it was 3 trips ago, some folks from Russia, Ukraine. This isn't xenophobic. This is about law and order. I'd like to recognize now the gentleman from Ohio and yield to him 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Ohio is
Mr. Miller.
recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. Treating migrants humanely as to where a young child will have to make a 300-trip journey, that they have no idea what's ahead of them, that they have to go with coyotes and drug traffickers. And when they drop children across the border wall, that does work. That's the nice things that they do to those children, and everyone here knows it, which is very upsetting. So treating them humanely would be responsible, and that's what H.R. 2 is in this piece of legislation. The southern border is in crisis. About 5 million people have illegally crossed into our country under President Biden's watch. The cartels have smuggled in 14 pounds of fentanyl. Border agents arrested 98 people on the terror watch list in FY22. This crisis is the direct result of the Biden administration's failed policies, and every American knows it. Under President Trump, we had a secure border. All President Biden had to do was nothing. All he had to do was sit there and do nothing, but he couldn't even do that. Instead, he took 94 executive actions to reverse the progress made under Republican leadership. Unbelievable. Republicans are once again acting to protect our nation from the gangs, drug cartels, and terrorists that exploit this crisis to hurt the American people. H.R. 2 resumes construction of the border wall. It pays our border agents what they need and what they deserve, and hires them to help what they desperately need in terms of assets. Biden's border crisis has raged far too long. Enough is enough. I urge my colleagues to vote for this bill and to secure our southern border. And I yield back.
Reserve. The gentleman from Tennessee reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the Child Deportation Act provisions requiring DHS to negotiate with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to return unaccompanied children will result in 550,000 children being deported back to the violence they fled from over a 10-year period. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 2 is an anti-immigrant and unchristian bill, just as legislation previously introduced by Representative Roy was. That is why nearly 150 community and religious groups oppose it. I ask unanimous consent to submit, for the record, letters in opposition from 136 community and religious groups, including Bethany Christian Services, Catholic Charities, and Union for Reform Judaism, Sojourners, U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Jesuit Conference.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
The gentleman from Mississippi reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Speaker. Ronald Reagan once said that it isn't that our liberal friends are ignorant, it's just that there's so much they know that isn't so. And as you hear the talking points come from the left concerning this bill, all the chicken little arguments that they're presenting about how the world's going to collapse, farmers won't be able to grow things, and our economy will crumble if we secure our border, it's just plain ridiculous. I live in South Texas in what they call the fatal funnel, in between two highways that lead from the border into Houston, which has become known as the human trafficking capital of the United States. I visited the facilities where 50% of the young women there, of hundreds of young women, will admit to being trafficked or being assaulted along the journey. I've visited the border and seen the families that have had their lives destroyed by what's going on at the border. And of course, we know about the fentanyl deaths, hundreds of thousands of it. And to hear the talking points come from the left as if securing our border is unchristian is absolutely ridiculous. I'm both a Christian and the husband of an immigrant. And I can tell you, I was there when my wife put her hand on her heart and said the Pledge of Allegiance for the first time as an American, and it really meant something. That's the right way to do it. We have a legal process and we have an illegal process, and the left continues to fund and continues to partner with the cartels and continues to allow them to profit to the tune of billions and billions of dollars to advance an illegal process when we need to enforce the legal process. We have a right way to do it, and we can do it. This bill secures our border, and the fact of the matter is that the Dems just don't seem to really care. They don't care about the lives that are being destroyed. They don't care about the people that are dying. They don't care about the young girls being sold into the sex slave. They don't care about... This administration has lost tens of thousands of kids. And so for all the tears that were happening under the Trump administration as he worked to secure the border, where's the outcry for the tens of thousands of kids this administration cannot track? What they are willing to fund is the border in other countries. They just funded a bill in December. We passed an omnibus bill. They were willing to fund border security in Libya, Lebanon, Pakistan, Nepal, Turkey. But here in the United States of America, securing our border is not something the Dems want to do. And of course, yeah, we'll get around to it. We just won't vote for anything that'll do it. They had the chance to do it. They did not do it. This bill will help secure our border. We need to pass it. I encourage a yes vote, and I yield back.
Reserve. The gentleman from Tennessee reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the bill would, quote, affect the legal status of 4.4 million people who would be granted parole or asylum under current law, unquote. Parolees fleeing war in Ukraine and the Taliban in Afghanistan, as well as those from Haiti and other failed countries in this hemisphere, would be required to leave the United States, and CBO anticipates that, quote, half would reside unlawfully in the United States, unquote. Mr. Speaker, with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Mississippi reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm up here in my capacity as not only as a United States Congressman, but also one of the co-chairs of the House Border Security Caucus. And on a monthly basis, we have had dozens of speakers come to speak to our caucus. Normally there's probably 30, but there's probably 30 are present. But we have an enrollment in our caucus of about 60 to 70, quite frankly. But it's amazing to me to hear our colleagues and friends on the other side of the aisle talk about humanity and humane treatment, because I remember in the previous administration when we had these so-called kids in cages, and I took a congressional delegation down to the Rio Grande Valley. We went to Donna, Texas, to see one of the detention facilities. After that, we went out to Carrizo Springs, to the HHS facility there. And then we went at a later time to Fort Bliss out in El Paso. And at each one of those, we saw these so-called kids in cages. And then we went back after the turn of the change of the administration, and dramatically, there was nothing really different except the enormous numbers of detentions in pods that were equipped to hold maybe 25 or 30, and they had a couple of hundred packed in these little pods. And I remember being told by the facilities there that the administration, the Biden administration at that time, that these unaccompanied children were coming in, and we're talking about 13,000 per month of unaccompanied children coming in now, that they were being so well cared for, and they were being reunited with their families and their loved ones. And I remember asking the folks who were in charge of these facilities, okay, if they're being taken care of, let me ask you a question, because I have 17 grandkids. Kids mean a lot to me. My wife and I have been married 50 years. We have 5 children and now 17 grandkids. Kids need to be cared for without question. And I said, are you doing any vetting of these so-called families? Are you doing background checks? Are you doing criminal history checks on these? Oh, well, we don't have the resources to do these. Are you doing DNA testing? Well, we don't have DNA. We don't have the resources to do DNA testing as well. Although during the Trump administration, they were doing some DNA testing. And so now we come to the point where there are 85,000 unaccounted for UACs under this administration's watch. Where are these kids? They're supposed to be followed up by the authorities in the administration where these children are being sent. 85,000 are unaccounted for. We have seen a skyrocketing of violations of child labor laws. We know that there are some real shady deals going on in this country, and that human trafficking, sex slavery, etc., is rampant. Is this part of that deal? I'm not up here pointing fingers in an accusatory way, but if you can't keep up with 85,000 UACs, we've got some real problems in this administration. We've also had conversations with Alejandro Mayorkas, who is the DHS secretary. I actually led that meeting, and of course he's not under oath talking to our caucus. I get 30 more seconds.
I yield an additional minute to the gentleman from Texas.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much. We are being told that Mr. Mayorkas says that he has operational control over the border. We are told that his policies are actually being successful. We are told that we have a secure border. Let me tell you something. We have anything but a secure border when you have 5 million people who come across our border, all of them getting free educations. I have a school district in my district, and I am 300 miles away from the border. My district is Houston over to Louisiana. We have a district there that is growing faster than just about any district in the country. And it's because of the influx of illegal aliens. And we are mandated to not only provide them with health care, but also with an education. But this is an enormous burden on our people, the local governments and the school districts that we have. This bill needs to be passed, and I urge very strongly that you vote yes on this to my colleagues.
The gentleman from Tennessee reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, Republicans claim that the Biden administration's policies have led to open borders, but nothing could be further from the truth. President Biden has, with little help from a Congress, worked to dissuade migrants from taking the dangerous journey northward. The Biden administration is surging resources to the border, and even as it ramps down Title 42 removals, it's using Title 8 authorities to promptly remove and bar reentry from certain crossers. At the same time, the Biden administration is working to make the asylum process more orderly through the CBP One app. It has also stood up a parole process for certain Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuban, and Haitian migrants that in March were credited with a drop of 72% in the 7-day average from a high of 1,231 in January. H.R. 2 would take those twos away from DHS. Mr. Speaker, it is also unlikely in the event that this cruel, extreme, and unworkable bill makes it to the President's desk, he has promised to veto it. To quote the statement of administration policy, H.R. 2 does nothing to address the root causes of migration, reduces humanitarian protections, and restricts unlawful pathways, which are critical alternatives to unlawful entry. It goes on to say this bill would make things worse, not better, unquote. I ask unanimous consent to include the administration's statement in the record.
Without objection.
With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve balance of my time.
The gentleman from Mississippi reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to take, an opportunity to correct the record on a couple of things. We often hear from our colleagues across the aisle that 90% of the fentanyl is seized at the ports of entry. Well, if you make the statement that 90% of the fentanyl that is seized at the ports of entry, well, that's correct. But oftentimes what we hear from the left is that 90% of fentanyl coming into the country is seized. We know for a fact that that math is absolutely wrong. If you put the amount seized at the ports of entry as the numerator, and the total amount seized as the denominator, yes, that's 90% of what's seized. And on the denominator would be 90% plus 10%, right? But what's missing in that denominator is all of the fentanyl that gets into our country that we have no idea is seized. So you can't technically say we're seizing 90% of the fentanyl that's coming into the country. That's factually incorrect. It makes no mathematical sense. And in fact, the Border Patrol itself is saying that we're actually catching about 5 to 10% of the fentanyl. So if it's 90% of what is seized at the port of entry, which I agree that statement is correct, it's 90% of 5 to 10% of the total. And that's an important point of distinction. I'd also like to talk a little bit about this CBP One app that my colleague from Mississippi mentioned. And all the other efforts that have been elaborated on by this administration, their efforts to maintain control of our border. Look, when they came into office, the budget didn't decrease suddenly. The number of Border Patrol agents didn't decrease suddenly. There was no new legislation that was written. What happened were 89 effective policies of two administrations that were completely undone by executive orders. And it resulted in an immediate incentive to come to the United States. They did away with all the disincentives of the pull factors of people coming into our country. And what happened is people came, they tested the system, they were immediately released into the country. Deportations were ordered to be halted. Over 1 million people with deportation orders that a legal process had determined they were supposed to be returned. Well, we're just not going to deport them. So the phone calls went home, and people poured across our southern border. And this incentive then was seized on by the drug cartels. They saw a huge opportunity, and so they flooded the crossing sites with people paid, interestingly enough, paying coyotes to bring them there. When I was down on the southern border, and that's sort of at the strategic level, right? They neutralized the Border Patrol at the crossing site, and then the fentanyl and other things come around between the ports of entry. That's the fentanyl we're not seizing. By the way, that's the fentanyl that has resulted in the street price of fentanyl in Tennessee going from $95 in January of 2021 to $28 just recently, according to the sheriffs of Tennessee. That supply-demand means more fentanyl is pouring into this country. So talk about 90% of it being seized. That is a false statement. And talk about the policies that supposedly are attempting to gain, are getting border control. That is incorrect. The incentives have allowed and empowered the drug cartels to take advantage, neutralizing the Border Patrol at the crossing sites. Back to the tactical level, on one of my visits in Arizona, we actually saw a scout from the cartels. And the Border Patrol agents and the law enforcement in that area informed us that those scouts have military-grade encrypted radios. They have military-grade optics that they're using, and from their vantage point, observing Border Patrol, they then notify someone else with this encrypted radio. They send 20 to 30 people to basically overwhelm that Border Patrol agent on the border, and while that individual's tied up, they send the fentanyl. That's when the carpet shoe-wearing, backpack fentanyl, that results in drop sites just inside the border where I saw hundreds of empty backpacks and carpet shoes, where the drugs are then placed into the hands of a courier in the back of a truck and transported to cities all across America, resulting in that supply. Make no mistake about it, the actions of this administration to remove those policies have resulted in this crisis. And one of the other policies that they so effectively have taken care of, Title 42, that will end tomorrow, will result in a catastrophe of epic proportions, already breaking records, and we see them massing throughout Central America to come into the United States. Now, you can have good intentions of wanting to help every person on the planet. That's great. But by making that something that taxpayers have to do, you're basically determining what someone else should be doing with their charity. And maybe somebody in Tennessee, our taxpayers, they want to do something for Gold Star families. Maybe they want to give to a different charity. Maybe they want to give to one of the NGOs that want to do something. But they should be the ones getting to decide, not the federal government telling them how their charity should be given. That's not freedom. And I'll tell you, the policies that have been canceled, that have resulted in this crisis, that have resulted in the cartels taking over 5 of our sectors of our southwest border, all on Joe Biden. Title II being canceled, and Alejandro Mayorkas. Title 42 being canceled, and what's about to happen state of emergency in cities all across the southern border, coming across, make every state a border state? Joe Biden and Alejandro Mayorkas. So I think it's really important we correct the record on some of this stuff. Now, I want to make one other point, and I want to warn my colleagues across the aisle. You know, President Biden promised to veto the D.C. crime bill. Remember that? He said, oh, we're going to veto that bill. And the Senate said, we're not going to vote for that. And you know what our Democrat colleagues did here in the House? They all voted no. And then the furor happened in America. And the president realized, boy, that'd be a big mistake. And the Senate said, oh my gosh, we're not going to do that either. And so the Senate voted for the D.C. crime bill. Now, the Democrat colleagues here in the House are going to have to go back and explain why they voted no when their party on the other side of the aisle voted yes, and their president changed his mind and signed that bill into law. Now, you watch the next couple of days as the border gets worse and worse, and that Americans become more and more and more aware. We're going to pass this bill. You can vote no on it, but as those senators get more and more aware of this crisis, and that president has to look at what's happening to El Paso and Brownsville, he just might change his mind again. And guess who's going to be left holding the bag? You don't want to vote no on this bill. This bill will secure our southern border. This isn't an immigration bill. We never set out to handle immigration with this. That's coming. This bill secures the border so that we can deal with the immigration issues. Because what we can't do is create even more incentive with an open border. That just does what Mr. Mayorkas and Mr. Biden have done, create more incentive that brings more and more people in and overwhelms our social services, overwhelms our schools and hospitals. As this thing unfolds over the next few days, don't be surprised if the president changes his mind again and you're left holding the bag. I reserve.
Gentleman from Tennessee reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers on my side. I'm prepared to close. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves.
All right.
The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's remarkable that Republicans are getting behind the Child Deportation Act, a bill that would blow a $6.1 billion hole in our federal budget at the same time that they are finagling concern about the federal deficit. Today, the other side has said a lot about how the Biden administration is handling the ending of Title 42, but remarkably, not one of them acknowledged that they voted to lift it in February. Enactment of H.R. 2 would do nothing to keep fentanyl out of our communities or protect unaccompanied children. And just for the record, in our section of the bill, fentanyl is not even mentioned. So I would hope at some point the other two discussions tomorrow might talk a little more directly about fentanyl if it's in there. But it's not in our section at this point. For the record, the information that we have in terms of the 90% fentanyl comes from the chief of the Border Patrol. I mean, it's his information, so we can only take him at his word. Those 5 ports of entry that the chair talked about, that was not what he said. He said it was in Mexico, not in the U.S. in terms of being controlled by the cartels. I think we all will admit the cartels do not control the border within the boundaries of the United States. So it's a play on words, but at least we can be accurate with that. In terms of how we determine who comes and who's captured and how the fentanyl is collected, I suggest that you talk to the FBI, Homeland Security Investigations, or DEA. They are the persons who interview the people who are caught at our ports of entry. And more importantly, most of the people that we catch at our ports of entry, they are American citizens. They are not, for the most part, immigrants or aliens or whatever you want to call them, trying to come into this country illegally. They are American citizens. In terms of guns, the cartels are a violent operation. There's no question about it. We need to do everything that we can to stop them. But we can't keep American guns from going to Mexico unless we come up with an enhanced policy to do that. We have to acknowledge that the majority of the guns that the cartels are using are coming from the United States. As the record will reflect, there's only one gun store in the entire country of Mexico. And it takes months for an individual even to get cleared to buy a gun. So we just want to keep the record to reflect the truth. Enactment of H.R. 2, as I said, would do nothing to keep fentanyl out of our communities or protect unaccompanied children. What it will do is penalize communities and religious organizations who care for vulnerable people. Section 115B is so broad that a nonprofit hospital that admits an undocumented migrant would be deemed as facilitating unlawful activity. Cartels and smugglers are chomping at the bits to see this bill enacted into law. H.R. 2 would create conditions where desperate people will be left with few options but to try and enter the U.S. illegally between ports of entry. It would be a boon for smugglers' illicit business. We should be coming together to enact sensible border and immigration policies that support our communities and economy. We can do better than the Child Deportation Act. With that, I urge a no vote on this extreme mega bill and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of my time.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an exchange of letters between the Committee on Homeland Security and the Committee on Ways and Means, and the Committee on Homeland Security and the Committee on the Judiciary regarding House Resolution 2794, the Border Reinforcement Act of 2023, which comprises Division A of H.R. 2.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The American people cannot wait any longer for secure borders and safe communities. Securing the border should not be a partisan issue. It's an American issue. And it is the federal government's responsibility to do so. And when they fail, Congress, a co-equal branch of government, should step in and hold them accountable. That is what we're doing here today. The Biden administration produced the catastrophic humanitarian tragedy we're seeing today, dismantling all semblance of law and order and sending a clear message to the cartels that our border is open. We've all seen what's been happening the past few days as Title 42 comes to an end. It is a fact that the border is in a shambles. Frontline law enforcement personnel are overwhelmed and overworked as they're stretched physically and mentally amid this crisis. State and local resources are quickly depleting as they attempt to do the job that this administration has not done since its first day in charge: secure the borders and enforce the law. The current situation at the border is unsustainable. Yet over the past 2+ years, my colleagues across the aisle have refused to hold the Biden administration accountable for its ineffective policies, have watched the border fall into the hands of violent cartels, and have completely ignored the disaster that has only gotten worse by the day. That must end today. The American people are fed up with the inaction. The Biden-Mayorkas border crisis is a national security threat that must be addressed immediately. I encourage my colleagues to join House Republicans in passing this very important legislation. And I want to close by addressing the patriots serving on the front lines of this crisis with no support or appreciation from this administration. Many of us have visited the border on several occasions across multiple sectors and have seen firsthand the work our Customs and Border Protection officers and agents do every single day to risk their lives for this great country. To the officers and agents on the ground dealing with this crisis, on behalf of the American people, we appreciate you, we support you, and we have your back. Mr. Speaker, with that, I again urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of H.R. 2 is postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourns today, it adjourn to meet at 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate and 11 a.m. for legislative business.
Without objection. The chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. Does the gentleman from the great state of Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, from the great state of New York, I request unanimous consent to